Hello, welcome back to my channel, Jack and Wealth. This is your host, Jack. Today we'll be talking about the journey of the Israelites from the Egyptian Empire to the Babylonian Empire, how the Israelites became a very strong nation, from a very strong nation, ending up as a slave in the Babylonian Empire. God's chosen people and their fall to Babylon, a biblical narrative of power, faith, and punishment. The Bible recounts many instances of God choosing individuals and nations to carry out his divine will. One of the most prominent stories in the Bible is how God uses chosen people, the Israelites, to defeat other nations, establish dominance, and serve as a light to the rest of the world. However, as the narrative unfolds, we see a tragic shift. The people chosen to uphold righteousness and worship the one true God fell into idolatry, aligning themselves with pagan practices and worship of false gods. This rebellion culminated in divine punishment. God allowed them to be defeated and captured by Babylon. The rise of Israel, a people chosen by God. The story of God's chosen people begins with Abraham, whom God called out of his homeland to form a great nation. Abraham's descendant, Isaac, Jacob, and eventually the 12 tribes of Israel were set apart to fulfill God's promises. These people were unique among the nations, not because of their numbers or powers, because God chose them to showcase his power and faithfulness to the entire world. Throughout the Old Testament, God repeatedly demonstrated his power through Israel, from the miraculous escape from Egypt under Moses' leadership to the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. Israel's rise to power was never attributed to their military might, but to God's divine intervention. God fought for Israel, guiding and protecting them as long as they remained obedient to his commandments. This fall of Jericho The fall of Jericho is a prime example. Joshua and the other Israelites were commanded to march around the city for 7 days, and without raising a sword, the wall fell down. This victory and many others underscore that Israel's strength came from God, not human efforts. Israel's role among the nations. Israel was not just chosen to dominate other nations, but to serve as a beacon of God's holiness. They were given the law, which set them apart in moral and ethical conduct. The Mosaic law was intended to distinguish the Israelites from the surrounding pagan nations who practiced idolatry, child sacrifices, and other abominable acts. By obeying God's commandment, Israel was meant to be a nation of priests, showing the world what a just, righteous society looked like under the rule of the one true God. However, Israel's victories over other nations were not purely for domination and territorial gain. The Bible makes it clear that God used Israel to execute his judgment on wicked nations that had indulged in corrupt practices for centuries. The Canaanites, for example, were known for their brutal and immoral practices, including child sacrifice. By defeating these nations, Israel served as an instrument of God's justice, removing wickedness from the land. The tragic shift, idolatry, and rebellion. Despite God's clear instruction, Israel eventually began to fall away from their unique role. As they grew in power and influence, they also grew complacent, adopting the customs and practices of the very nations they had conquered. The allure of pagan religions within their visible idols and ritual began to draw the hearts of the Israelites away from the invisible God they served. Kings like Solomon, despite his wisdom, began to turn to the worship of foreign gods, influenced by his many wives from different nations. This pattern of idolatry continued and intensified with later kings like Ahab, who built altars to Baal and led Israel into widespread apostasy. The prophets repeatedly warned Israel of the consequences of their rebellion, Prophets like Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah spoke out against the nation's turn to idolatry, urging them to repent and return to God. However, their warning often went unheeded. The Israelites not only turned to false gods, but also oppressed the poor, practiced injustice, and violated the very law that sets them apart as God's chosen people. The worship of fallen angels, particularly through the guise of idols like Baal, Asherah, and Moloch, became rampant. Their deities were often connected to fertility rites, weather control, and military success, offered an enticing alternative to the worship of an invisible God who required moral purity and justice.